from Atsion. Am I saying that right? I know there's multiple.
Atsion.
Atsion.
It gets very confusing. It gets very confusing because when you say Atsion refers to the village of Atsion, but Atsion refers to the lake and the river. So it gets very confusing. So
No wonder.
Well then.
So the funny story is, before I started working at Atsion, my mom would always pronounce it Atsion, and I would do the same until I started working there. And then I started calling it Atsion in front of my mom, and she got very upset with me because I committed treason or something for pronouncing it wrong.
Okay.
Okay, Nick is a
come on over.
seasonal historian at the home there, and is responsible for the home. Yeah, I'll just avoid it. I'll avoid it. He is has a major in history at Rowan, correct?
Currently majoring in history.
Okay, all right, very good. And so with that, it's a pleasure to announce Nick.
Well, thank you, and thank you everybody for coming tonight. So out of curiosity, we all know about Batsto Furnace and Batsto Village. How many of you have been to Batsto Village? Now, how many of you have been to Atsion Village? That's exactly what I thought. Most of the room put their hands down. So my presentation tonight will kind of give you a little bit of the history into Atsion and the famous Richards family who tie into Batsto, but also tie into Atsion. And getting into the early history of Atsion, where does that name come from, Atsion? It's a pretty peculiar name. The name Atsion actually comes from two Native American words, Axon, meaning rock, and Unk, meaning place. The words combined tend to create this word called Atsayuk, or place of rocks. Now I say place of rocks, and now you're kind of saying to yourself, what's just sand and flatness around here? But what we think the place of rocks mean is, if you've ever toured Batsto, you have what's called bog ore, which is sort of the main resource being mined out of the Mullica and the Batsto rivers for purification in these iron furnaces. And in fact, the iron production is where our first gentleman comes in, a man named Charles Reed. Charles Reed was born in 1715 in Philadelphia, and he was elected to the 18th New Jersey State Assembly in 1751. And in that one term that he served in the assembly, he was elected Speaker of the House. And between 1765 and 1766, he established iron furnaces at Batsto, Taunton, and Etna. If you're not familiar where Taunton and Etna are, if you're familiar with Medford or Medford Lakes over in Burlington County, that's where those two furnaces were built by Charles Reed. And Charles Reed petitioned the damming of the Atsion River in 1765 for an iron forge. Now the Atsion River today is more commonly known as the Mullica River. And Charles Reed, he establishes this iron forge in 1767. However, the forge was mainly reliant on cast pig iron from the Batsto furnace, which was established in 1766. And at this forge, you had pots, salt pans, tea kettles, and really more domestic goods being cast at the Atsion forge before it became self-sufficient in 1774. And by 1771, Charles Reed, he owned shares or owned 4 different iron furnaces, and it's a real strain to be essentially the owner of 4 different iron furnaces. And it got to a point, by only a few years after he established the property, he was already putting his shares up for sale. And 3 Quaker men by the name of Drinker, Salter, and James purchased Atsion from the Reed estate in 1773. If you're not familiar with the story of Charles Reed, I mentioned earlier, he overextends his finances and gets into a lot of financial trouble. So what do you do when you have to declare bankruptcy in pre-colonial America? You flee the country. And so in 1773, Charles Reed, he gets on a ship out of Philadelphia, ends up in the Bahamas, which at this time of year sounds pleasant, if you ask me. He goes down to the Bahamas and then ends up in North Carolina, where he passes away in 1774. But his property at Atsion falls into the hands of three men by the name of Henry Drinker, Lawrence Salter, and Abel James, who are three Quakers from the Philadelphia area. And it's these three Quakers that actually construct an iron furnace the following year to make Atsion essentially self-sufficient from the Batsto furnace about 5 or 8 miles downstream. Now the furnace did operate during most of the Revolutionary War. However, being Quakers, if you know anything about a Quaker faith, they're very pacifist and they don't believe in violence. So while we are producing goods here for the Continental Army, or during the Revolutionary War, we're really producing domestic goods, camp kettles, and iron of unknown type for the Continental Navy. Most likely that iron was used in the construction of ships rather than cannons and cannonballs that are going to be cast right here at the Batsto furnace. And this right here, this is a silhouette of Henry Drinker right around 1790 when the Atsion furnace is in its first era of prosperity. However, all good things must come to an end. And in 1794, a fire actually destroyed the outbuildings of the furnace, the casting house, the bellows house. All of that was destroyed in a fire in September of 1794, dampening much of the production that was going during the Revolutionary War. The loss was estimated at around £1,000, which today is $215,000. This was a devastating loss. And while eventually the furnace and the outbuildings were rebuilt, it never got to its pre-Revolutionary War momentum. Now, during the Downing years, Henry Drinker's son-in-law purchased Atsion from the Drinker estate in 1805, and this was really the last era of prosperity for Atsion before the purchase of the Richards family. Downing's main product at the furnace were 6-plate stoves, and this right here, this is an example of a stove that was built or cast at the Atsion furnace during the Jacob Downing era. And in case you're wondering where this furnace is, or the stove is, if you're familiar with Bridgeton, about half an hour away, I want to say, this is located in the old Bridgeton Church right on Main Street, and there are actually 2 of them in that church that have survived to 2025. Atsion Furnace made thousands of these stoves during its industrial heyday, but only 3 of them exist to the modern day. 2 of them are here in the Broad Street Church, and 1 of them is at the Crosswicks Meeting House in Crosswicks, New Jersey. There we go. And so this is a, if you're familiar with John Watson, he was a very prominent historian out of Philadelphia in the late 1810s, early 1820s, and this is what he had to say about the ruins of Atsion in 1823. He was much interested to see the formidable ruins of the Atsion Iron Works about 27.5 miles away from Philadelphia. They looked as picturesque as the ruins of abbeys in pictures. There were dams, forges, furnaces, storehouses, a dozen houses, and lots for the men, and the whole comprising a town. A place once overwhelming the ear with the din of unceasing ponderous hammers, or alarming the sight with fire and smoke, the smutty and sweating Vulcans, and now all is hushed. No wheels turn, no fires blaze, the houses are unroofed, and the frames have fallen down, and not a foot of the busy workmen is seen. And from this description in 1823, you kind of get the impression that, well, Atsion's already done for. However, this wouldn't be a Pine Barrens presentation unless we bring in the Richards family. And so right here, this is Samuel Richards. He was the older brother of Jesse Richards, who is the iron master down at the Batsto furnace. And it's really Samuel Richards who brings new life into Atsion. He began purchasing property in Atsion around 1819, but he didn't gain full ownership until 5 years later in 1824. And when he gained full ownership, he brought the furnace back into Atsion and made Atsion a self-sustaining iron village again. So this right here, this is that portrait of Samuel Richards that was done by Thomas Sully in 1827. Next to him is his second wife, Anne Maria Richards. she eventually ended up over in Belgium where she passed away, but that's actually a story I will tell you later in this presentation. And his two children, Maria Lawrence Richards and William Henry Richards. Now we'll also get into the story of Maria Lawrence Richards a bit later. But during the Richards era, the estimates are that around 700 people were living at Atsion at this time, and the iron furnace was producing an annual profit of $20,000, which is today close to $700,000. So it was a very prosperous iron community in the Pine Barrens. Richards eventually established his country estate here in 1826, and in 1830, the Atsion Iron Furnace was the first iron furnace in the Pine Barrens to do what is called the hot blast method. The hot blast method is you would actually heat the charcoal up before using it in the furnace. It saved costs and fuel production decreased. And by 1839, Richards had began experimenting with silk production at Atsion. In 1839 is an interesting date because it's right around that time that the iron business in the Pine Barrens began to decline based out of competition from these northern Jersey iron furnaces and these eastern Pennsylvania iron furnaces. Now this right here, this is the Atsion Mansion. If you're driving up 206, if you have ever checked into camping at the Atsion office, it's very hard to miss this building. This is the mansion that was built by Samuel Richards in 1826, and the mansion is built in what we call Greek Revival architecture style. If you've seen these pictures of Greek or Roman temples, you can see vaguely how that influence is copy and pasted onto the Atsion Mansion. Now the mansion is around 8,000 square feet, and it contains 6 bedrooms and a spacious double parlor, which doubled as a ballroom for the mansion. Now one thing I like to point out about Samuel Richards is that he loved to party. If we took him into a time machine and brought him into 2025, you'd probably find him at a frat house down at Stockton University, and that's how much he loved to party. But his main residence was on Arch Street in Philadelphia, and this picture right down here is a picture of Arch Street in 1854. And the one thing I hate about this picture is that if the photographer just moved a little bit to the left, you would have Samuel Richards' home right there in the picture. But unfortunately, like a lot of things in history, so close, yet so far. And so this is a picture of the mansion around 1823, and you'll notice that there are actually people on the porch. Now, these are not members of the Richards family, these are squatters. By 1923, the mansion had been abandoned for around 30 or 40 years. And one thing I like to point out about this picture is that if you sort of look on the second floor, you can see how the stucco actually alternates colors. Today, if you go to the Atsion Mansion, it's sort of this one tan color, but the original construction of the mansion tells us that it was polychromatic stucco, an alternating red and yellow brickwork. And I kind of like to joke with some of my tour groups when I talk about this polychromatic stucco, red and yellow. We think Samuel Richards might have been sponsored by McDonald's in the 1820s. But it doesn't help that when we looked at his letters, he spells Friday F-R-Y-D-A-Y. Now, I'm not a believer in many conspiracy theories, but this, I believe 100%. And so this is actually one of my favorite pictures of the mansion. This is taken in 1954, the year the Wharton tract became Wharton State Forest. And you can see just how much disrepair the mansion is in. You have shutters falling off, the stucco is peeling away, and all this brush right in front of the mansion, that's actually what remains of the garden that Samuel Richards had planted at the mansion. One of the main crops that Richards grew at the mansion was cabbages. And what we know from Samuel Richards is he loved sauerkraut. We actually have some testimony from the caretaker for the mansion during the Richards era, a woman named Mrs. Parsons, and she actually testifies that Samuel Richards would be in the basement kitchen trying to make his own sauerkraut. I'm told it wasn't very good though, so I would probably politely turn it down. Now this is the mansion as it appears today after a $1.3 million restoration by the state of New Jersey. And I don't know about you guys, I think I prefer this version of the mansion to this version of the mansion. So this right here, this is inside of the Atsion mansion, and these are what we call the double parlor rooms. Now this, I had mentioned earlier, acted also as a ballroom. Now back in the 1820s, there would have been loads more furniture inside, mirrors, paintings, family portraits, all that inside of the mansion. And what you can tell from this picture is that the ceilings are actually 13 feet tall. It's a very deceiving building, because when you look at it from the outside, you're like, this is some old building. When you think of a mansion, you like to think of the Batsto mansion. But when you head inside of the mansion at Atsion, it's a completely different story. So here, this was sort of the main public area of the home. And then this was the dining room of the mansion. And this fireplace is made of what's called King of Prussia blue marble, which was an extremely wealthy type of marble that only the richest of Americans could afford. Hence, it makes sense that Samuel Richards, a wealthy iron master, would put it into his home at Atsion. And so this right here, this is the kitchen in the Atsion mansion, and this is located in the basement. The ceilings in here are around 7 feet tall, and it's worth mentioning that Samuel Richards was 6'6". Wow. It's an incredibly tall man. You wouldn't guess that from the portrait I showed you. And like I said, we had testimony earlier that Richards was down in this basement trying to make his own food. Probably a very tight fit to get down there. And now right across from the mansion, you have the general store. This general store was built a year after the mansion in 1827, and it was sort of the main community hub for the villagers. If you think of ShopRite today, this was the village's version of ShopRite. You can find clothing, sugar, coffee, and your other daily needs in this store. And from 1827 up until around the Civil War, this general store was using what's called company script. If you've ever been down to Batsto Furnace, Batsto Village, they kind of talk about company script. And to kind of explain company script, it's currency that you're paid for your work that's only good in the village. So for example, if you work for Amazon today, and you're expecting your first paycheck, congratulations, here's a $50 Amazon gift card. That's kind of what company script was back in these old towns in the Pine Barrens. And in 1834, the post office was established in the store. Little fun fact, the post office in the store is actually my office today, so we like to keep history alive in there. And it actually served as a general store up until 1946. And since the 1960s, this has served as the ranger station at Atsion. If anybody has done camping in Wharton State Forest, have any of you checked into this building at Atsion? Kind of skipped it a little bit. So this is the picture on the left is a picture of the store as it appeared right around the 1960s during its first restoration project. And this is another picture of the general store right in 1923. You have the mansion right over there. But one thing I'd like to point out about this photo is that the woman standing in the doorway was a woman named Mamie Etheridge, who ran the general store until it closed in 1946. And I'll talk about the Etheridge family as we move along in the presentation. There we go. And there it appears today. Now you can see how it's changed over the years. From 1923, you have the belfry on top, you have sort of more to it at the back, and then here it is as it appeared in 1827. Now this right here, if you've ever been to Atsion and you follow down Quaker Bridge Road, this is where you'll find the Atsion Church built in 1828 during the Richards era. And during the Richards era, it served all denominations. So if you were Baptist, Presbyterian, Catholic, you could come worship at the church. And the graveyard at the Atsion Church is still an active graveyard, and it is still an active church today. This is as it appeared in 1923. And here it is today. Currently, it is a Baptist church, Grace Bible Baptist Church, And this is really one of the only plots of private land you'll find in Wharton State Forest, right in the village of Atsion. And now, unfortunately, we have to say goodbye to Samuel Richards. Samuel Richards managed Atsion for the remainder of his life until he passed away at the age of 73 in January of 1842. Samuel Richards, he owned about 200,000 acres of land just in New Jersey, comprising of his Weymouth, Atsion, and Martha furnaces, as well as Hampton Furnace and Speedwell Furnace over in Chatsworth. He also owned some property down in Mays Landing. If anybody is familiar with Mays Landing, the American Hotel or the Samuel Richards Hotel, where the, I guess it's a library today, I want to say, that was built by Samuel Richards in the 1830s, and that was part of his Pine Barrens property. Atsion fell into the ownership of his children, Maria and William, who I introduced to you earlier, but it was really Maria who took the most interest in running the village and the furnace through the remainder of the 1840s. Her brother, William Henry, got an inheritance of $50,000 and was like, see ya, I'm gonna go live on a farm. And he actually remained, I don't know if this will work, but but those buildings right on the lower left corner, that house where the road bends in, that was William Henry's home. Unfortunately, it has not survived to the modern day. And this right here, this is his funeral announcement in the North American newspaper from January 7th, 1842. And after Richard passes away, his daughter Maria marries a man named William Walton Fleming from South Carolina. Fleming was an industrialist over in Camden and Philadelphia. He operated the Cobalt Works in Camden. And by the time the Fleming family comes into ownership of Atsion, or William Fleming comes into ownership, the iron era at Atsion is almost at an end. Iron prices are collapsing. These iron furnaces that have been going since the 1770s, 1780s can no longer keep up with these larger blast furnaces coming out of Pennsylvania and northern New Jersey. So William Fleming decides to experiment with paper making, and between 1853 and 1854, he constructs a paper mill at Atsion using materials from the old iron furnace. And this right here, this is the Fleming family. This is Maria Lawrence, right around the 1850s, and her husband, William Walton Fleming. Now, believe it or not, that is her son, Samuel Richards Fleming. You would think it was her daughter, by the way he has his hair done, which, when I found this picture in Philadelphia, I had to do a double take for a minute. I'm like, that's a man? It is. And so this right here, this is a picture of the William Fleming paper mill that was constructed or completed in 1854. And these are some advertisements from the Fleming estate of sort of different experiments he's doing at Atsion to keep the economy going. He decides to use the 3 sawmills that were operating at Atsion to try to make a lucrative lumber business in addition to the paper mill production. However, didn't go exactly as he turned out because, well, here we have another picture of the paper mill. This is taken right in that 1923 time frame, but you'll notice that there was an extension put on, which we'll get to in just a moment. Now, one thing we know about Fleming, he was a complete fraud. Fleming was caught to be forging hundreds of checks in Camden and Philadelphia. What he would do, we actually have the original case book from the Fleming case. What he would do is he would take checks from his creditors, erase out the amount that the check was for, and just rewrite the check amount, but keeping the signature of the original signer of the check. So to him, it was all good. However, his total indebtedness by 1854 was $660,000, which today is $25 million. He was not a good businessman. I mean, that is the understatement of the century, I should say. And sometime in 1854, he fled the country. When he fled the country, he didn't tell Maria, he didn't tell his family, he just got on the first ship out of Philadelphia and fled. So what Maria had to do, she had to hire a private investigator to track him down. And it took a few months, but they found him in Belgium, of all places. So you would think Maria is pretty upset with Fleming, but she decides to forgive him for whatever reason. Not the route I would have gone with. But eventually she sells her shares at Atsion and moves the entire family over to Belgium, where they stayed for the remainder of their lives, and that is where they're buried, over in Belgium. And now we have our first name change coming to Atsion. After the Flemings left the country in the late 1850s, in 1862, a man named Colonel William Patterson purchased Atsion, and he renamed the town to Fruitland, which is not the name I would have gone with, just putting it that way. But he decides to rename the town Fruitland because he wanted to move Atsion away from industry and into agriculture, and his main crop that he wanted to experiment in Fruitland was French sugar beets that he imported from out of state. However, if you're familiar with the geology of the Pine Barrens, these French sugar beets are not good to grow in the sandy, acidic soil here in the Pine Barrens. And if Patterson invests most of his fortune into a business failure, how do you think that's gonna go? Not good. So the venture is a failure, and after 9 years, he sells the property to a man named Maurice Raleigh. And this right here, you have a picture of William Patterson at the top, and right below you have a picture of, this actually never came to fruition, but it was the proposed street grid for Fruitland. And this right here, this is actually the newspaper that was published at Fruitland called the Fruitland Farmer. However, it was only one edition that was printed on July 14th, 1866. And he sort of prints this newspaper to advertise the lands at Fruitland. He divided the property up into hundreds of 20-acre plots and kind of said to people, oh, this is a good place to establish a summer home, a winter home. The water is clean here, and you have easy accessibility via the railroad to cities such as Philadelphia, Wilmington, New York, and Cape May. But no matter how good of a writer you were, it just wasn't gonna work. And this right here, this sign Fruitland, this is the original train station sign that was established for the Fruitland station. This is currently in our general store at Atsion. And the story behind this sign is that we almost lost it forever. Back in the 1980s, some of the maintenance workers were sort of clearing out old junk in the attic, and they're like, oh, better throw this out. Luckily, one of our historians saw it, saved it from the dumpster, and now I'm able to show it off in 2025. And now that does bring us into the railroad at Atsion. The station was built in 1870 when the Southern Railroad of New Jersey reached Atsion from the south. And it was an active agency until 1949. Eventually, the building was moved to the Gardner family farm in Chemung Township. The front facade of the station was taken off, moved to the Philadelphia Flower Show in 1979 as a display item, and then thrown away after. Unfortunate. So this is, that's a picture of the station from 1923. And just to kind of give you an idea of where Atsion falls on the railroad's map in New Jersey, you have Atsion right there at this sort of junction from Atco and Winslow Junction. And then your next stop would be Whiting, or if you're going down, Winslow Junction, and take you down all the way to Vineland. And this is a picture of the station from right around 1909. And what I like about this photograph is there's a person on the waiting for the next train to come to the station. Now John Etheridge, I mentioned the Etheridge name before. John Etheridge was born in 1886 to Andrew Etheridge and Phoebe Etheridge in Batsto. When he was 6 years old, he relocated to Atsion when his father was offered the management position for the Atsion farm, and he served as the station master for the railroad station from 1912 all the way until his death in 1958. He served as the station master for 46 years. So this is a picture of him taken around 1910, 1911. This is a picture of him in 1920s sitting on the Atsion water tower, and right over here you have the train tracks going up to the station. And here he is standing on the railroad platform. He is joined by a fellow villager by the name of Charles Harris, who also worked at the railroad station. So this is another picture of that station from 1920. And then when we fast forward to 1980, dilapidated, overgrown. When the Gardner family moved the station to their farm, they kind of thought, what do we do with this nice historic building? We're going to turn it into housing for our farm hands. And so the entire railroad station was converted into housing for the farm hands on the Gardner farm. And where that front facade was taken off for the Philadelphia Flower Show, you can see that it was replaced with a cinder block addition. Unfortunately, by the early 2000s, the station had rotted away, and unfortunately, none of it remains anymore to the modern day. And after Patterson sort of sells the property in the early 1870s, a man named Maurice Raleigh purchases the property of Fruitland and thankfully renames it back to Atsion. And it's really Raleigh who's going to give Atsion its last era of self-sufficiency. He takes the Fleming mill and he extends it for the production of cotton at Atsion. The cotton mill produced an estimated 500 pounds of yarn a week. And what also assisted this venture is that the railroad that was established at Atsion, you could import your product by the railroad, create your finished product in the mill, and then ship it along the railroad to New York, Philadelphia, Wilmington, or any of these other major cities along the eastern coast. And during the Raleigh years, the population of Atsion had grown back up to 300 residents. However, it would never get to the almost 1,000 people during the Richards era. And when Raleigh suddenly passed away in 1882, the property was handed down to his sons, who did not maintain the property and let the land essentially just fall into disrepair once again. And this right here, this is a picture of the cotton mill right around the 1920s. You have the original Fleming mill, and then you can see where Raleigh extended it in 1871. This is the mill as it appeared in the late 1960s. By 1977, however, an arsonist broke into the building and set it ablaze. So unfortunately, in March of 1977, we also lost the cotton mill. And if you're familiar where the Mullica River boat launch is today, you might recognize this chimney at the boat launch. A lot of people mistake it for the Atsion Iron Furnace, but this was the chimney for the cotton mill that is surprisingly still intact into 2025. And this is a map of Atsion during that Raleigh prosperity. You can see the cotton mill right over there. You also have this large grist mill right at the end of Atsion Lake, and also these sort of smaller homes where the workers resided. But also you'll notice the railroad station coming through, and then you would take the northern end to Acco or the Vineland down to Winslow Junction. And these right here, these are duplex homes that were built during the Raleigh years. You could fit 2 families in these homes. I actually, just recently, I met somebody who lived in these homes in the 1950s, and she's still alive today. So she's been very helpful with trying to get the history of Atsion before it became a state forest. Now, the Atsion Hotel was built sometime in the early 1880s during this Raleigh years. The hotel was built to serve passengers that were coming into Atsion via the railroad, and it was owned by the Phillips family until the 1930s. Unfortunately, we also don't have the hotel. It was torn down in 1956. So this right here, you have the hotel in the foreground, and then in the background, right at the bottom right, you can see the cotton mill. Kind of give you a perspective of where exactly these buildings were. And now we get into the infamous Joseph Wharton, our namesake here for Wharton State Forest. He purchases Atsion in March of 1892, and instead of keeping up with industry, he wants to convert Atsion back into agriculture. So Joseph Wharton begins the cultivation of peanuts and cranberries at Atsion. The Richards Mansion and the cotton mill are turned into cranberry storage and packing houses. I always like to, whenever we do a tour, the home has no electricity or indoor plumbing in it, I always like to say Joseph Wharton saw this grand mansion here at Atsion and he said, this will make a lovely warehouse. And if you were in most of the buildings at Atsion during the Wharton years, just stacked to the ceiling with cranberry boxes, peanut boxes. The farm was making a profit of around $12,000 every 4 months, I want to say, so around $50,000 each year. And this right here, this is Joseph Wharton inspecting his peanut crops at Atsion. And this building right in the back over here, this is the back end of the Atsion Church, kind of giving you more context into where some of these photos were taken. And this right here, this is looking away from the church, and these are Wharton's peanut fields at Atsion. This right here, this is the Wharton family standing in front of the Raleigh cotton mill, which is now converted into a packing house for the farm. And you can see in front of it, all of these boxes stacked up high for storing cranberries, peanuts, and other crops that Wharton is going to be growing at Atsion. Now, right across from the mansion, and during the Wharton years, this is where the Etheridge family lived. I mentioned Mamie Etheridge earlier, John Etheridge, but it was Andrew Etheridge who moved his family to Atsion in 1892 because Joseph Wharton had offered him the position of being the manager of the Atsion property. His daughters ran the general store, and Andrew served as caretaker until his death in 1925. The Etheridge house also fell victim to an arsonist flame on the 1st of March, 1997. And so this is the Etheridge family dog, Jig, right in front of the Etheridge house, but we can't overlook their other dog, Arnold. These were actually given to me by a member of the Etheridge family, and they're my favorite photos ever of Atsion because they have dogs in them. And so this is the Etheridge house as it appeared in the late 1960s. After the Etheridge family moved out in 1954, it was boarded up. And you can see how it's in the state of decay by the 1960s until that 1st of March, 1997, when a teenage boy broke in and burned it to the ground. That boy was apprehended, however, I'm not sure where he is today. And this right here, the Wharton Barn, if you're also familiar with the land at Atsion, you have your mansion, you have the general store, and then this giant concrete structure without a roof. This was the mule barn built by Joseph Wharton in 1909. It featured poured concrete and was used to store horses and mules for use on the Wharton property. While the main structure still stands today, the wooden roof, the wooden doors, and most of the window sashes and the shutters have rotted away. So this right here, this is a picture of it in 1923. You have some workers of the Wharton farm here with a horse. And then this right here, this is a picture of that barn during the blizzard of 1932. You have your barn, the mansion in the background, and of course we get to meet Jig again. This was taken from the porch of the Etheridge house, and again is one of my favorite pictures of Atsion. And this is the barn as it appears today. Structurally, the concrete has miraculously held up for over 100 years, and it'll probably be there for another 100 years, if I'm being honest. And now, I showed you some pictures of Atsion as we went throughout the presentation, but these are some more that I wanted to include. This right here, this is another view of the cotton mill built by Raleigh in the 1870s, and you kind of get the idea just how large this building was. Right in the front of the picture here, where sort of this vegetation is going up, this is the Mullica River. Again, if you're familiar with the canoe launch at the Mullica River, this is taken from the other side of the riverbank. And like I said, unfortunately, nothing really remains anymore. And this is a picture of the general store taken from the porch of the Atsion Mansion. Right here, this is a picture of the mansion. And like I said, you have more squatters right on this porch here. We don't know who these people are. However, they're sitting on an original settee owned by Samuel Richards. Now, what happened to that settee? I have no idea. If I had to be honest, they probably took it with them. So who knows where it is today. But here again, you can kind of see the sort of toll that these uninhabited buildings have taken by the 1920s. You have window panes missing, shutters falling off. And this right here, this is a picture taken from present day 206. And this foundation right here in front of the mansion, this was the grist mill for Atsion Village. The story behind the grist mill is that it was actually original to 1797, dating back to the Quaker years of Henry Drinker. However, there was a thunderstorm in 1917. Lightning struck the roof of the grist mill and it burned to the ground. So these foundations were all that was left in 1923, and then the foundations themselves were torn away when 206 was paved and widened in the 1930s and the 1940s. This right here, this is another picture of the Atsion Station. And this right here, this is an aerial shot of Atsion Village taken around 1940, 1942. You can see some buildings. You can see the large mill right over here. You have worker homes, the hotel, and right over there in that grove of trees, you have the mansion. Again, kind of providing some context into where a lot of these buildings fall into the grand scheme of Atsion Village. And now Atsion in 2025, when Joseph Wharton passed away in 1909, his entire Wharton tract, which at the time consisted of 123,000 acres, fell into the care of the Girard Trust over in Philadelphia. And in 1954, the state of New Jersey purchased the tract for $2 million. The story behind the purchase of the tract is that Joseph Wharton's daughter, Anna Wharton, she was still caretaking the property, and by that point she was in her late 80s. She didn't want to really be taking care of a 120,000 acre plot of land anymore. She was approached by the federal government, who offered her $1 million, and their plan was to make this into an Air Force base. And then she went to the state of New Jersey and she said, all right, I have a $1 million offer. What can you offer me? We offered her $2 million, which thankfully she took. And in 1956, Wharton State Forest opened up as a public state park. The Atsion Rec area was constructed in 1977. And how many of you have gone swimming at the Atsion Rec area? Very good, very good. And then in 2009, the state undertook a $1.5 million restoration of the Atsion Mansion, and a few years earlier, the general store. And to give you an example of some of the activities we do at Atsion today, we do offer our evening tours. This is the parlor rooms in the mansion as they appeared in our January evening tours. And also in our parlor rooms was the site of the Libby prison minstrels who performed in the mansion on Atsion Day in October of last year. And thank you for visiting Old Atsion Village. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them, but if not, thank you for listening.
Thank you. Very good.
Excellent. Yeah.
I do have a question.
Yes, I have an answer.
That last picture before that with Atsion, the way it is. No, the one with the, yeah.
Mhm.
See the curve back in there?
Yep.
See where it is now? Well, that's where we used to go swimming, back in there. And the dam.
Right
the
over
older-
here?
The older kids would go off the dam. That was before all that was. I never liked that part. It looked like a spaceship. And I thought, oh, this historic area with those cabins across the way, and they build this thing here.
Well, what a
But
lot of
then, that's what they did.
and what a lot of people don't know
Yeah.
about.
And we always refer to it as Atsion Lake.
Thank you.
Atsion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What people really don't know about this area is, as you said, a lot of people went swimming there before the rec
Right
area was built.
around, like I said, in that, right off the road,
Mm.
right off of 206. And you would just park wherever. Well, I wasn't that old, I wasn't part, so whoever, I went with my cousins and stuff.
James, you had a?
Yeah, I know where the railroad tracks are through the forest. So where was the station?
So the station, let's see, kind of go back to this aerial map. Do you know where the canoe launch is today at Atsion? So the canoe launch is right here where the mill used to be. And then right back here, you kind of take this road, this is where the station was. Right where, it's kind of a blurry aerial, but it's the best aerial I could get. So the station was here, you had the hotel right here, the mill right here, and these worker homes that were actually standing until 2008 when they kind of collapsed in on themselves. But yeah, that kind of gives you an idea of sort of the general area around Atsion. Where the station is, you see the one track going towards Atco, and then it continues this way down to Winslow Junction.
I thought I had heard somewhere that where the station was, there's still some concrete.
So where the station was, you'll find scattered bricks of where the station was. When the Gardner family moved the station, they essentially just picked it up off of the foundation, moved it up a few miles to their farm. So the foundation is technically still there, although 70 years of overgrowth have kind of eroded it down into just a few scattered bricks.
And then there's a little bridge. Is that fairly close to the station? Is that just cross the Mullet?
Which bridge?
I don't know. There was a couple pictures posted on Facebook recently, within the last 2 weeks, of the railroad bridge.
Railroad bridge.
Railroad bridge. I'm sorry.
Yep. So if you took the tracks down this way, so you see how the Mullica River, trying to see if I get it correct. Mullica River comes down this way. That bridge is right there.
It's right there. Okay.
So it's right there in Atsion. It would cross the Mullica River before getting you to the station. Any other questions? Yes.
Nick, you're having just too much fun with this.
Oh, you could tell?
There's an old house that's a log cabin. Is that a real log cabin?
So that log cabin has actually piqued my curiosity for as long as I've been working there. What's piqued my curiosity is that I don't know when it was built, who owned it. It was built probably around the time of the Etheridge house because it has the same gingerbread detailing on the roof trim. However, we don't know when the Etheridge house was built either. It looks like that house was built in stages. That log cabin, from what I understand, they would take the logs, cut them in half, and then plaster, kind of just put them onto the sides of the wall. Me and John were actually there a few weeks ago, and we looked, and there's actually chicken wire on the interior walls. So this is
Holding a plaster, right?
yeah. So that building is an enigma in of itself. Like I said earlier, we have no idea when that was built, who lived in that building. But I'd like to find out.
Bud Wilson was under the impression it was a very old building. It was one of the oldest in the extent. I don't know if that helps any or not.
Maybe. But yeah, like I said, a lot of as much as I like to talk about Atsion, one of the things I don't like to talk about is that cabin because I need to do more research on it. But like I said, it's an enigma. Trying to figure out when it was built, who lived in there. We know a woman named Mrs. Rose Lane was living in it until 1992, and then after that, boarded up, and that's actually still standing today by the canoe launch. But yeah, like I said, that's kind of the building I know the least bit amount of in the village.
I want to poke your brain
All right.
for a couple of questions that are not directly related to Atsion, but close.
Uh-oh.
When you are traveling up 206 north and you pass the mansion, on the right-hand side, there's a dirt road that goes back there. Was that the road of the famous shooting?
Yes.
Yes. Could you tell us a little
That's
bit
where it
about
is.
that, or
Mhm.
what you know?
I
Yep,
know about
Andrew Ryder,
that.
correct?
Yeah.
Yep. So when I do tours of the Atsion mansion, in the other parlor room, which if I can get it up here, you can kind of barely see it, but right over here, on top of this other marble mantle, there's a piece of graffiti that was drawn in January of 1923 that we believe depicts the infamous Ryder shootout in October of 1916. And it did happen on that road, Hampton Road. The story is that Andrew Ryder had gone into, I think it was Hamilton actually. Medford was it? Medford, thank you.
Burlington County trespass.
But he lived here.
He lived, all right.
Oh, he lived in Hamilton.
And he had about $4,000 in cash in the car, and they drive onto Hampton Road, which I'm not sure if you can see on that aerial because it's kind of like off of the map, but where that dirt road is, and they're driving along that road where the shootout occurs. I want to say it's about 2 miles back. I actually took a tour of, I forget their name, but they're part of the Preservation Alliance, and they pointed out the exact spot of where it happened. There's sort of like a bend in Hampton Road that, from what I understand, I think it was about 12 members in the gang that came out in these large coats and masks, and they came out of the bend because that's where the car would theoretically be caught off guard. Luckily, the riders got away with the money, if I understand correctly, but it happened just around 2 miles inwards off of Hampton Road, because Hampton is where Ryder had his headquarters for his, I want to say Atsion tract that he had at Atsion, but he was going back to the headquarters when the shootout occurred.
Now, the shootout is 2 gangs or police and chasing them? I don't know anything about it.
From what I understand, it's a topic I need to look more into,
Okay.
of course. But from what I understand, it was Ryder going back to his headquarters because he had picked up the payroll for the cranberry workers, and it was actually members of or citizens of the Hampton Bogs that had plotted to take the payroll money. And fortunately, Ryder got away, but unfortunately his brother was killed in the incident. I'm kind of upset I didn't put a picture of that graffiti in the presentation, but it's a pretty cool picture if you ever tour the Atsion Mansion, which I highly encourage you do. But it's this beautiful charcoal drawing done of this car just swerving through the Pine Barrens that we think sort of depicts the Ryder car escaping from the shootout.
Cool. Okay, my second question. Traveling north on 206 before you get to Atsion is a road that's now closed the entire way. It's West Road. West Road. He's looking at me funny. It is a road where they have music festivals.
Oh yeah, that road. Yep.
I'm sorry.
Campground.
Well, partially.
Goes to the campground.
The whole way, because if you followed that road, it would go all the way to the Methodist Church before Batsto. And the river there flows into the Nescashe Lake, I believe. My question is, there was a very old sawmill, it was West Sawmill, on that road, probably the mid-1700s. And this is actually within the town of Hamilton. Do you know anything about that sawmill or?
My short answer,
around it?
unfortunately not.
Okay.
It kind of goes outside. I've looked at a few older maps of like Burlington County, Atlantic County. I have seen that sawmill. However, I haven't really done a lot of research on that area of the property, unfortunately.
Yeah, the foundation is still there.
Foundation.
Yeah, the foundation's still there. Or a mill.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer on it, but I can look into it. Sounds pretty interesting.
We have some articles from one of the Hamilton newspapers from the 1960s that show a lot of the ruins. And we've been told by, and correct me if my facts are wrong here, by Mr. Miller, who now owns that land, that the sawmill that was in that area was actually sunk in the river or the lake that is right there. And at one point, the wheel. Why don't you, I'll let him explain it, he's much better at this.
He said that the wheel from the sawmill, when it was dismantled or whatever, was basically thrown into the lake. And a number of people found it, took the wheel, pulled the wheel, and we believe, I think the story goes in the 1980s, the wheel was pulled back out of the lake and taken to Stockton University to see if they could preserve it, see if there was anything they could do to save this wheel. And the answer was basically no, put it back in the lake. But we thought it went back, we were under the impression that it went back into West Mill Lake, or Paradise Lake, whatever they call it now. And, but then we found out more recently that the wheel is in, I can't remember the name of the. Fred's Lake at Stockton. They put it back in the water there.
Just in the wrong lake.
It's in the wrong lake, but it's better preserved in the fresh water than it would be in the fresh air, I guess, was the thought. But they thought it was just too far gone, it would keep deteriorating. So apparently, supposedly it's in that lake, and that's from pretty reliable
When you say
sources.
Mr. Miller, do you mean Fred Miller is his name?
What is his
There are
name?
several Millers, so I'm not sure which one it was, which one it is.
Because I know the Fred Miller who owns that property, so it might be the same Miller that I'm
Yeah.
thinking about. I actually have a meeting with him next week, so I'll ask if he knows more about it. But unfortunately, that's kind of a part of the property that I haven't explored much of. I'd like to get back there and explore, but whenever I see music festival, I'm like, nah, not for me, and I just keep on driving.
Yeah.
Go for the food truck festival then.
Oh, I'm definitely going for that.
The little mill, the ruin of the water wheel mill is not that far from his main thing there. It's right at the end of the lake. It's a short walk.
Anyone else have any knowledge of that area?
We have a time check here too, it's 8 o'clock.
Oh, okay.
Any other
If you need a
questions?
chauffeur while you're going there, I'd be happy to go along with you.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Is all that area accessible to the public at any time?
Mhm.
Okay. By car?
By which area? You mean at
In the
sign?
map, right there, that whole area in the map.
Yeah. So this right here, this was called the Tuckerton Stage Road in the 1820s, but today it's more commonly known as Quaker Bridge Road, and that's one of our more popular off-roading roads. You can actually take it from Atsion all the way down to Batsto. It's about a 12-mile drive, but it takes you right around kind of in the middle of Wharton State Forest, and then it takes you south down into Batsto. You can drive on that road. You can drive to where the mill was. That's where the canoe launch is today. Back here, sort of, you can't really drive back there, only because where the hotel was, today it is currently a dump site for our maintenance team. So unfortunately, not much to look at. So
Where's the hotel location again?
hotel,
Yeah,
right over
right
here.
there, okay.
They have the hotel there, and then right across from the railroad station.
So
Any
where's
other-
that little cabin, the little log cabin that,
Right
Straight up.
here.
okay, yeah, all right.
Yeah, so it's known today. It has like a red roof on it. It's falling apart. But like I said earlier, it's kind of an enigma. I'd like to learn more about it, but it's such a unique building that historically I get very confused, because it kind of screams one era and then it starts screaming like during the Richards era or the Raleigh era, and I'm just like, just tell me when you were built. That solved a lot of my questions. Did you raise your hand?
In that map area, is that where the plane crashed years ago?
No,
Plane crash.
he's talking about it the other day.
Oh, Carranza?
Carranza.
That's way-
Yeah, Carranza crashed about 12 miles away in
Yeah,
Chatsworth.
Further back in the woods.
Further north and east.
Any other questions?
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.